Hello, fellow Chanimals. We're now going through the last section within the system, policies, and process. In this case, we're going to be talking about different reseller types, and we're actually going to be talking about the margins and how to pay the resellers. So 3 things resellers look for, again, is your product positioning. Next is how do I make money? And that's your competitive margin, your services, your add-on products, recurring revenues. And then, of course, the last thing is, do you love me? Will you take care of me when I come on board? So we're going to talk now about show me the money. So far as the margin terminology, it will actually vary by your channel type and product type. So it always starts with a manufacturer suggested price, or an MSRP. And one of the reasons we have that is because we often discount off of that price. Now, there's something used, it's mainly used in retail. I don't see it used nearly as much with the VARs anymore, but there's a concept called points versus percentage. They're not the same. We used to always use points. So it's like, okay, it's 50 points, your point discount off of the price through distribution. But let me explain what that whole thing means. So in wholesale distribution, the points, if you gave the distributor 50 points, it refers to the point markup. That's not the same as a 50% margin, also called the gross profit. Markup is the percentage amount you earn on the cost of an item you sell. Gross profit, or your margin, is a percentage of the amount you earn on the selling price of the item. Your markup is usually figured on your cost. So if you purchase software from distribution at $50, if you sell it in retail for $80, that's $30 above the cost. So you divide the earnings of $30 by the cost you paid, $50, that equals 60%. That's your percentage markup on the cost. Now, the gross profit or margin is figured on the sale price. So you purchase your software from distribution at $50. You sell it in retail for $80, which is $30 above the cost. So you divide the 30 earnings by the $80 selling price, and you get 37.5%. That's your margin or gross profit on the selling price. So you earned 37 cents on each dollar of sales. So it covers the expenses and the net profit. Okay, points is not often used among non-retailers. So everything that I just mentioned, if you don't work in retail, just forget about it. It's just too complex. Most of the time, we just discuss a percentage discount off the MSRP. So if it's a 30% margin, if your product MSRP cost $100, less 30%, $70. That one's easy to figure out. Okay, also, when you look at this, you want to review common industry margins. So I have a different survey. You'll also compile your competitors' margins, so you don't work inside of a vacuum. You know, it's hard to go out there and tell a reseller you're going to pay them 20% margin, and then you find out later that the entire industry is paying them 30%. You also can look at determining margins for like products. So if a competitor has no channel, you can't really use your competitors to sort of find out what would be the going rate for that. So you would look at other similar type of products in your general category. So if you're marketing automation software and you had no competitors, which is not the case, you might look at CRM, because both of those are similar type of products, maybe even the same enterprise level. So if all of CRM pays 30% as a margin, then you can expect that's sort of the expectation. The next part is determine how much to pay. That's for different type of levels. If you have an affiliate program, it might be 10%. If you have an authorized, and then even within the authorized, you have multiple levels, you'll be paying different. Now, SaaS has some specific type of pricing issues that you have to consider. Things like, over what period do you pay? Do you pay the first year, over several years, perpetual? Do you pay the same amount the first year and subsequent years, or do they vary? And the next part is, who collects and who pays who? Do you pay a commission, or do they buy wholesale? How quick do you pay if commission? And then, of course, the last thing is you want to test your margins with the resellers, and then you would go ahead and finalize that. So there's a document that is part of this section that talks about how to determine your reseller margin. So this is for a SaaS product, but again, most of the other products are going to be pretty much similar, except for you wouldn't have to worry about how soon do you pay or anything else if they're paying that way. But so far as the process of how to do that, this document explains it. So I'm going through a few more slides to tell you, but you do have this document, and typically what I recommend is just print the document out, go through each one of those. There's a video, how to create a SaaS reseller program. Here's the link to it. Slide 32 talks a little bit more about margins. So when I say that you compile your competitors' margins, sometimes people say, well, where do I get that? Sometimes it's not nearly as difficult as you think it is. A lot of times you can just check their website. Sometimes they have it listed there. Sometimes you can send an email to the channel manager or call them up if you can get a hold of them. You can even ask some of their resellers, what's their margin? So long as they sort of verify that you're a vendor, usually they don't have too much of a problem. Now let's go through the rest of these slides. So your margins will vary by channel and product type. So VARs typically would make 20 to 50% margin, discount off the MSP for a desktop and enterprise software. And so it averages maybe 40%, but take a look at the breakdown of this. It might be 20% for sales and marketing when you sort of think of what they use this money for, 20% for overhead, the office equipment, support, billing. So they make much less when they don't have this kind of an expense. But they also discount heavily on competitive bids. So even though they might make an average of 40% margin, after they get through with the bid and they do the discounting, they might only make 20 to 30% on those bids. Now, it's also interesting because sometimes they can discount on their software, but then they would have additional services, and sometimes they could throw in their services instead of discounting the prices. But most VARs make their real money off their value-added services, like their installs, configuration, their training, localized support. Now, within retail, it's going to change. For software, you typically don't have levels. For like a Best Buy, you would just have the same price for a Best Buy as you might have for a Walmart. Now, there might be some of your local resellers, your national, your mass merchants, but your 40 to 55% off the MSP is common. Also, the discount takes into account 3 to 7% wholesale distribution cost. So you might sell it into Ingram Micro as a distributor for 55% off your MSP. They might then mark it up to cover their distribution costs, their shipping costs, their returns. They might mark it up 3 to 7% and also the margin they need to be able to handle all of that process for you. And then the reseller would get the difference. But again, this can also vary by product category. So when you look at fast-moving consumer goods, your wholesale might make 3 to 10%, your retailer 8 to 40%. Your clothing and apparel, 15 to 30%. So you can see some of the different variables over here according to the type of product and the category that it might sit in. So a question, how does it get discounted 50% during promotions? Oftentimes the vendor will reduce the price just to try to keep the product in there, or they might be running a special. Sometimes the vendor might run a clearance. So sometimes they're willing to discount the product heavily just to prevent dreaded returns. Nothing is more shocking than having a great big semi-truck pull up at your office building, not your warehouse, and the guy walks in and says, "Where would you like me to take all of this return inventory?" So this is one way, at least you can discount it in the field to reduce those kind of returns if you didn't really properly manage your channel. There's some interesting observations. The Apple phone iPhone X will cost them $357 to produce it. They'll sell it for almost $1,000 with a 64% margin. But there's very little margin that actually goes into the retail. So it's like 8% retail margin. Now, also I've seen it 6.5% margin, and it went down a little bit more. Now, how can retailers do that? Well, first with an iPhone, they've done so much work on the branding. There's no selling. Somebody walks in, it's just strictly fulfillment. So how do they make money? They'll usually make it off the peripherals, which is why you'll find that inside of retail, an iPhone case might go for $39, yet the cost of goods for that actual case might be $1. Similar cases, you can pick them up on Amazon because, again, they don't have to make their money off of this when someone walks in and buys an iPhone. Same thing with like a cable. So if you want to get an iPhone cable, it might be $29 through Best Buy, but $10 through Amazon. Now, it's also interesting because Samsung, they have a margin that's almost twice the amount for their phones. But the difference is you've also got to try to sell somebody on an Android. And with Android, there's multiple competitors. So there's a lot more store interaction. They're doing a lot more work. And that's one of the reasons why they're getting paid this extra money. And also to get the sales reps in the stores to pick their product up because, again, there's so much demand for the Apple iPhone. So most of the value provided in retail is fulfillment, not promotions or any real selling, which is, again, one of the reasons why that margin goes down. Now, let's just take a look at the typical margins. Sometimes people say, okay, this is all great, but just tell me what my margin should be. So here are the most common margins for SaaS products. If somebody has an affiliate program, which remember, they don't close, they just generate a lead. So you need two salespeople, one to generate the lead, the affiliate partner, and then somebody to close the business. If it's just a link that goes to your website, and maybe the customer fills out just a contact form for you to then call them up and close the deal, that would typically be 10%. If there's a referral form, which is the model that Salesforce uses, then that would be 15%. But that also includes a lot of pre-approach information. How big is the deal? Who do you talk to within the organization? Sort of what are the politics involved? So it's worth more to you, and hence you pay more. For resellers that actually close the deal, your authorized might be 20%. Your gold would typically be 30%. They make more money because they also save you money in support costs because they're supposed to handle the first line support. The first level certification is really just the training necessary to be able to handle that support. They also will assume a quota, and the consistency of that quota is worth money to you also. So it's not like you're paying more money. It's like you're getting more value for your money anyway, and that's why I think of this also as a volume discount. And then Platinum has additional support requirements, and typically I see it's about a 5-time multiple of the gold so far as the Platinum quota. So think of that again as volume discounting. So this is where these margins typically sit within the industry. An OEM deal where they supply all support, pre-purchase volume, they're often 50%. So I had one product, for example, that we would sell for $49. That would be the SRP price. We got about $25 for that in retail. We'd sell it to Apple for $1. But the difference is that Apple would buy 1 million copies. So our cost of goods for all million was $1 for the CD when we would send it to Apple. They'd pre-install it on all their machines. So at a 20% gross margin, it would essentially take $5 million in sales to get that $1 million in cash that we got from that OEM deal. So these are at least the typical margins that you should consider. But even though these are common, I start with these, and then if I see any indicator in the channel based on the competitive research, then sometimes you can either go down, sometimes you might even have to go up. Now, the margins by all types of different services, because there might be margins for affiliates, resellers, your white label, your wholesale distributors, your hybrid distributors, your SaaS distributors. What about consultants that help you to recruit? What about rep firms? So there's a document also that's part of this section. And when you open up this document, it will show you what the typical averages are for every type. There's very little chance that you're going to invent some type that hasn't already been used before. So this here shows you what you should expect. So here's your typical 10% for referrals with links, 15% with the referral form. Your retail over here, I gave you sort of those margins. Over here with your VARs, your 20, 30, 40, 50% for white label or OEM. And your agents are often just another VAR. It's just a different name. Sometimes it might be an agency, maybe an ad agency. They add additional service to your particular product, but they're the same as a VAR. They'll just use a different name, like an agent. Your wholesale distributors, this is where it might be 3 to 7%. Your hybrid distributors, sometimes we have a reseller out there that will sell direct to customers, and they'll also sell to other resellers. Maybe because the other resellers may not be able to do the volume or whatever kind of requirements that the vendor may have put together. If they sell directly to the customer, then they would be considered a reseller in that case, so they would make the same margins. If they sell to another reseller and they're not actually a wholesale distributor, then oftentimes they might even just make a bounty. So they might make a percentage, maybe 10%, 5% if they sign up a reseller that orders through them, or they might make a bounty. Otherwise, a lot of times there's no real reason for a reseller to order through that particular distributor. There's also a concept of VAD, value-added distributor, or sometimes it's a country manager. So for example, if you go into Japan, where you might have to change the language, you might have a hard time connecting with the different people, they have a sense of xenophobia, they have a social culture that you may be unfamiliar with, then a lot of times you'll sign up a specific distributor in that area, value-added distributor, a country manager that will do everything. They'll have big quotas, a performance clause. similar to an OEM or a white label, but this is at least what their ratio would look like. Your SaaS distributors, like SaaSmax out there, would charge 10%. So for that value, you get discounted consulting, you get help with your database, they can help with your recruiting. They also have a marketplace where resellers and customers can find your products. And then there's also this unusual case where there's a consultant. I have one in my company, their competitor laid a lot of their channel salespeople off. So the company hired the channel salespeople and gave them a 10% commission if they would help the company to recruit that competitor's partners. Now, this could vary depending on what your business model is. Maybe they make that 10% for the first year, ongoing. Maybe the first year it's 10%, 5% thereafter. But they also have to have some concept so that it's not like an Amway type thing where you're just going to make money for life. So they have it where the consultant has to remain active. So they have to keep doing this because it's not just a perpetual pay. It's based on their ability even to be able to support those resellers. Then there's the rep firms, specifically like your retail rep firms. They'll help with a lot of your sell-in. They'll manage your co-op. They usually have a 5% of your sell-in plus actual approved expenses. Some of these used to have where they just had a higher sell-in and no expenses, but they found that some of the vendors would not send the inventory out on time. And so when they had a fixed cost, in addition to their percentage, like let's say $5,000 a month or $10,000 a month to cover all their plane flights to go out and talk to the retailers, this is one of the ways that they prevented a loss if the vendor just didn't step up and help out with getting that inventory out to the buyers. So there's some other different models in here too, but this will give you enough information for a ballpark until you do your competitive analysis. And if you don't know any better, if you don't have access to that, I wouldn't do it just because you're lazy. Then I would just use these particular margins. Now, you may not like these margins. That's fine. But just try to recruit a partner at 20% when they're already making 30%. And you'll hear things like, I love your product, I just can't make a third less revenue this year. So in many of these cases, just like when you step into a market and you're sort of the new person, but it's well established, you might be a price taker. If the going rate is $100, you try to come in there at $200, you might get a lot of resistance compared to the competition that sits on the shelf. With a reseller program, you may also be a margin taker, not the setter. So if that's the going rate, that is what it is. Build your business model around that. So you may have to reduce your cost, increase your price. So what is your actual going rate? Make sure it's also apples to apples. You have to look at your competitors' margins. Retail's relatively easy. Enterprise is usually the hardest, especially if it's like $1 million product with all these different variables. Sometimes you could look at your competitor's website to find this. Sometimes, again, contact your channel manager, ask one of their resellers, Google it. And it's not just that margin, like I was mentioning. There's also additional questions that you have to ask. Who pays who? Do I place the order from you, or do you collect from the customer and pay me? Do you have levels? How much margin per level? Where do you start? Most of the time I start my partners at the gold level, but do they have something similar to that? What are the qualifications per level? How soon do you pay? How long do you pay? Do you have a partner program page? Again, these are variables that you're looking for. So you'll see many vendors will have a sheet like this that shows their resellers what the margins are and what the requirements are. So this is something that you want to look for. If your competitors don't have a reseller program, then again, look for like products, similar to like what I'd mentioned just a few minutes ago. These companies have already set an expectation. If their general margin is 35% in your category and you offer them 20%, you're going to have a hard time recruiting. The next thing is how much to pay by level. So that's the links, the referrals, the authorized. You've already got the ballpark, but again, these are questions that you want to ask. There's also something else you have to take into account. What kind of behavior do you want to reinforce? Do you want your resellers to support the account after the first year? If it's an affiliate, somebody may come from their website. They may not even know who that customer is, so they have very little influence. So a lot of times your affiliate program, so long as it's competitive, you can pay maybe over the first year if it's a SaaS application or just a single time. If they are a VAR and they've been working with this account for a long time, then you may find that you're going to get in trouble if you only pay them the first year. The second year, what happens, they step up and they will actually switch your prospects or your customer to another product because they don't make any money. So what you do is you put your money where you want the behavior. If you want them to continue supporting this, not switching it, if they can influence the account, then you're going to have to pay them over time. So based on this behavior, over what period do you pay? Over the first year, over a few years, over the entire life of the account? Even enterprise pays after the first year because they typically have a maintenance fee or they have to sell them upgrade products. So that's actually their model. They do have a perpetual model. And if you just pay them for the first year, you've literally broken their model. Do you pay the same amount the first year and subsequent years, or does it vary? So I've seen it before. You might pay 30% the first year. Maybe the industry average right now is 25%. So to make it a little bit more appealing during the recruiting process, you might say we pay 30% the first year, 15% the second year and thereafter. But the reseller here is 30%, even if your overall margin is the same as what they're already making. So it's an interesting approach that I've seen. It has this perceived higher margin, and so it might make it easier to recruit your competitors' partners if margin is important to them. The next thing is, do you collect from the customer and pay the reseller a commission, or do they buy from you at a discount? So about 70% of all the companies from SaaS, they will collect from the customer and they will pay a commission to the reseller. 30% of those, for example, Google, they'll allow the reseller to take the order. They'll buy it from Google. Let's say it's $100. They'll buy it from Google at $70 and they'll make their margin right up front. There's also a misconception. Just because you take the order does not make the reseller an affiliate. I hear this a lot. Someone says, well, I'm taking the order. They're not resellers. They're just affiliates. The difference is they're sending you a closed deal. It's similar to a salesperson working at a remote division. They send you a purchase order because, again, they close the deal. So referrals send you leads. Salespeople send you closed deals. You don't need a salesperson internally to call them up and maybe even work with them for months to close that deal. You just need customer service, someone to process the order. A lot of times you just send the customer an invoice and they'll pay it. The next thing is, how quick do you pay? I was shocked the first time that I found that Salesforce would collect and then they pay their resellers 30 days after the end of each quarter. So let's look at this. If you're the sales guy and you're going to make 100% commission, it could take you 4 months before you see anything. So it's the old adage, doggy does trick, doggy gets bone. 4 months later, doggy doesn't get very motivated. So I had a similar case over here with a vendor, and he paid that same way. I was a little shocked. He says, I just pay my commissions on a quarterly basis, and I pay it usually their first check after the end of the quarter. And then he was saying, but my salespeople, they're not very motivated by their commissions. Well, that's not a surprise. So the rule is you pay as fast as you can process and afford it. Usually you always want to pay within 30 days. And it's actually easy if you tie it to your payroll. So if you pay on the 1st and the 15th, everything that you can get calculated, collected, everything else, and you can get that thing out on the 15th, get it done. Otherwise, it gets paid on the 1st and the following. So if you pay your inside and your channel with the same model, you have identical type of behavior. They sort of do what you want. But if this varies, sometimes you can have some weird things that happen. When your salespeople internally are paid one way, your channel is paid a different way. And then, in one of my certification meetings, you raise your hand saying, my resellers aren't motivated by the commission. We can look at this, and it's usually because of even the speed of how fast you're paying them. The other part here is you don't want to break their model. You think you're really cool. You've got good negotiation skills, so you soak them and you got the lowest margin possible. The problem is you starve the channel. So direct sales is the same way. So they're not making enough money, they either die, they quit, or they find another product line. So you got a short-term advantage on that particular deal, but you're not going to get the long-term advantage of a reseller channel. So how much do you like recruiting? That's the real question. Because if you break their model, you're going to be doing a lot of recruiting. Resellers built their model on a certain revenue coming in. So if you pay less and they can't afford you, they go under and you lose your channel. So make sure they make the same or more if you change the model from like on-premise or enterprise to a SaaS application. So let's look at some of these models. So a SaaS model is typically based on a 2.5-year return. So if you had $10,000 in initial price, if you're trying to figure out what your SaaS price would be, you just take that 2.5 years, divide that by the number of months, and you could split that and determine how much you're going to pay per month. So that's really what it is. It's a 2.5-year finance plan. So think of an enterprise application where they make a margin. So they sell the product for $10,000, the initial sales price. They also include the first year's maintenance fee of 20% for the first year, 20% for the second year, and then the 2.5 mark is only half of the year, so that's $1,000 for that. So they're really not making $10,000 off of that product. They're making $15,000. And from that, they earn $5,000 if they made a 33% margin, just trying to make it simple. So if we have an enterprise margin where it's $15,000 revenue, they make $5,000, and you only pay for the first year, then you've only paid them $2,000, not $5,000. If their business model is built and you're paying them essentially 60% less, you're going to have a lot of partners that are going to be struggling just to survive. They're going to be very hungry on you. Essentially, you've given them that 40% pay cut. And typically when they come on board with you, they're trying to make more, not make less. So after the first year, they may have come on board thinking, oh, this product's going to sell a lot more. But if it doesn't, they've lost money. They either quit or they die. So it's not a good model. It's not very cool. You've killed the goose that laid the golden egg. Let's come over here and think of the SaaS margins. So again, it's 10% for a link, 15% for a referral. It's okay if you get reminded on this. I don't know how many times where we've covered this multiple times, and then you start a new partner program, your reseller says, how much are your margins? And you even forget what your own margins are, let alone what the industry averages are. 20% for authorized. It's interesting because, again, I find about 50% of my partners are authorized partners, because some can only sell the product periodically. Maybe it's because their area, they don't live in Los Angeles or New York, where they've got tens of thousands of potential customers. So they won't be able to hit the quotas to be able to get the gold level. So that's why about 50% of it comes from that authorized channel. The other comes from the gold and then the platinum. They're actually pretty rare, your platinums. And again, they usually have to build their entire business around your product to be able to hit that kind of a quota. Most of these are also paid over the lifetime. So long as that partner remains active, sometimes you might say, okay, you've got to sell maybe 2 products per year. Otherwise, I'm going to consider you in retirement. But if they do that, you'll pay them over the lifetime, and then you pay your commission the 1st and the 15th. These are the industry best practices and what I would typically recommend, unless your competitive analysis shows there are differences within your particular channel. Okay, so there is the document that you can download that shows how to determine your margins, your distribution models, defining your partner program. So these are all going to be found in the course section, and these will be able to help you as you're determining your reseller margins. So that's it for the entire section on the program setup, system, policies, and process. Thank you very much.